Thomas Wiggins was born into a world that had already decided what he would never be allowed to be. He came into life in 1849 on a plantation in Harris County, Georgia, blind from birth, black, enslaved, and surrounded by a system that measured human worth in ownership rather than possibility. His mother, Charity Wiggins, was enslaved, and like her, Thomas entered life as property, not as a child with a future. From the moment he was born, the odds against him were absolute. He could not see, he could not choose, he could not speak in ways others understood. And yet, from the earliest days of his life, there were signs that something within him did not belong to the rules of the world that claimed him. As an infant, Thomas responded to sound with an intensity that startled those around him. While other children cried or slept, he turned his head sharply toward noises, no matter how faint. The creak of floorboards, the rustle of fabric, the distant rhythm of work songs sung by enslaved laborers in the fields, all of it seemed to enter him deeply. Sound was not background to him, it was language, landscape, and memory combined. Long before anyone thought of him as a musician, they noticed that he remembered sounds with frightening precision. If a sound happened once, it stayed with him. The plantation owner, General James Neal Bethune, did not initially see this as a gift. Thomas was small, blind, and considered by many to be unfit for hard labor. In a system where productivity defined value, this made him nearly useless. Yet because Thomas could not be sent to the fields, he was allowed to remain near the main house where music lived. Bethune's daughters practiced piano regularly, filling the house with European classical music. Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, played imperfectly by young hands still learning discipline and technique. Thomas, barely able to walk, would sit near the piano and listen. No one taught him, no one instructed him, no one imagined he was learning. Then one day, after the house was empty, Thomas climbed onto the piano bench and placed his small hands on the keys. What came next did not sound like random noise. It was structure, it was melody, it was memory made audible. He played back entire pieces he had only ever heard once, reproducing not just the notes, but the timing, the dynamics, even the mistakes. When the Bethune family returned and heard the piano playing, they were stunned. They assumed one of the daughters was practicing. Then they saw Thomas. At first, disbelief turned into fear. A blind, enslaved child reproducing complex piano music without training disrupted everything they thought they understood about intelligence, race, and ability. Some whispered that it was imitation, coincidence, or trickery. Others, less generous, claimed it was something unnatural. But the truth became impossible to deny. Thomas could sit at the piano and replay any piece after a single hearing, sometimes hours later, sometimes days. He could do this with hymns, marches, popular tunes, and classical compositions alike. Music entered him once and never left. As Thomas grew older, it became clear that his abilities extended far beyond imitation. He began composing original music, not on paper, but directly at the piano. One of his earliest and most famous compositions, The Rainstorm, was inspired by the sound of an actual thunderstorm. He recreated rain, wind, thunder, and lightning on the keyboard with astonishing realism, blending natural sound with musical structure. Audiences later described feeling as if the weather itself had entered the concert hall. This was not mimicry. This was interpretation. Despite his musical brilliance, Thomas did not speak in full sentences. He echoed words, he repeated phrases, he responded to questions indirectly, often through sound rather than speech. Modern historians and neurologists widely believe he was autistic, though such a diagnosis did not exist in the 19th century. At the time, he was labeled idiotic or simple-minded, labels that allowed others to dismiss his humanity while exploiting his abilities. He was seen as a phenomenon, not a person. Bethune soon realized that Thomas represented something far more valuable than labor. He was spectacle. He was profit. By the mid-1850s, Thomas was being taken on tours across the southern United States. Audiences paid to watch a blind enslaved child perform musical miracles. Posters described him as Blind Tom, a name that stripped him of identity and turned him into a curiosity. Crowds were encouraged to test him, to shout out complex musical challenges, to play pieces once and demand immediate reproduction. Each time, Thomas delivered. As the crowds grew larger, so did the cruelty of the performances. Thomas was forced to play for hours without rest, He was paraded as proof of natural talent divorced from intellect, reinforcing racist myths that black people could perform but not think. White audiences marveled at his abilities while denying him agency, freedom, or dignity. He did not receive payment. He did not choose where he went. He did not even control when he played. The piano became both his voice and his cage. In 1859, when Thomas was just 10 years old, his fame reached a historic peak. He was brought to the White House to perform for President James Buchanan, becoming the first African-American musician known to play there. Newspapers across the country reported on the event with amazement and condescension in equal measure. Some compared him to Mozart. Others called him a human parrot. None questioned why a child with such ability remained enslaved. Behind the applause was a quieter, darker reality. Thomas did not understand contracts, money, or fame. He understood sound. He understood repetition. He understood the piano. When performances ended, he was returned to rooms where he slept alone, often isolated, often confused. The world treated his silence as emptiness, never considering that it might be fullness no one else could access. As the Civil War approached, Thomas's value increased rather than diminished. Even as the country fractured over slavery, audiences continued to pay to see him perform. During the war itself, he was taken north, where slavery was illegal, yet he was never freed. Legal loopholes, guardianship claims, and exploitation ensured that control over his life never truly left the hands of others. Freedom existed around him, but not for him. By the time the war ended, Thomas was no longer a child, but he was still treated as one. His body grew older, but his autonomy did not. He continued touring, sometimes performing multiple concerts a day. His memory expanded endlessly. He could recall thousands of pieces, political speeches, sermons, even entire conversations, reproducing them verbatim years later. His mind was a living archive in a society that refused to see it as such. What made Thomas extraordinary also made him vulnerable. His inability to advocate for himself allowed others to decide everything on his behalf. Managers, guardians, and promoters controlled his schedule, his income, and even his personal habits. He was fed, clothed, and housed not for comfort, but for preservation of the asset he represented. His humanity was secondary to his utility, and yet, despite everything taken from him, Thomas continued to create. He composed music that blended classical European forms with American sounds, spirituals, and natural environments. His work existed outside categories, much like he did. He was too black for white institutions, too unconventional for classical conservatories, and too controlled to leave a legacy on his own terms. Still, the music endured. The world around Thomas continued to expand, while his own remained tightly contained. Wherever he traveled, cities unfolded through sound alone. He learned the rhythm of New Orleans by its street music, the pace of New York by the echo of carriage wheels, the tension of wartime America by the change in the voices of crowds. He absorbed everything. His mind did not filter experience the way others did, it collected it whole. People later said he remembered more than was healthy for a human being to carry, as if forgetting were a mercy He had never been given. Despite the constant travel and performances, Thomas lived in a state of emotional isolation. He was often kept apart from other children and adults alike. Conversations happened around him, not with him. Decisions were made over his head, sometimes literally, while he sat at the piano bench waiting to be told when to play. When he repeated words or phrases, people laughed or treated it as novelty, never realizing that repetition was how he processed and understood the world. Silence, for Thomas, was not absence, it was safety. As he grew into adolescence, the expectations placed upon him became heavier. Audiences no longer wanted to see a gifted child. They wanted to see an impossibility sustained. Every performance had to be more astonishing than the last. He was asked to play 2 pieces at once, one with each hand, or to reproduce a song backward, or to imitate sounds of battle, animals, or entire orchestras alone. Each challenge was framed as entertainment, but it was also a test of endurance. Failure was not an option he was allowed to have. The piano itself became an extension of his body. Those who watched closely noticed that his hands moved not with strain, but with an eerie calm, as if the music were passing through him rather than being produced by him. He did not count measures. He did not consciously analyze harmony. He played as if recalling a dream. When he finished, he often returned immediately to a state of stillness, rocking slightly, humming, or repeating fragments of sound under his breath. Applause meant little to him. It was noise, not meaning. By the late 1860s, Thomas was one of the most famous performers in America. He had played before generals, politicians, and packed theaters. Newspapers continued to write about him, but the language rarely evolved. He was still described as childlike, strange, less than fully ancient. The idea that his silence might contain intelligence rather than absence was never seriously entertained. In a society already invested in denying black intellect, his difference made dismissal easier. Money flowed constantly because of him. By some estimates, Thomas generated the modern equivalent of millions of dollars over his lifetime. Yet he owned nothing. He did not choose his clothes, his meals, or where he slept. When slavery officially ended, his condition did not meaningfully change. Legal guardianship replaced ownership, and control remained absolute. The system adjusted its language but not its behavior. Those closest to Thomas noticed subtle signs of distress over time. He became more withdrawn between performances. Loud or sudden noises unsettled him. Long tours exhausted him, though he was rarely allowed adequate rest. When denied access to a piano, he became agitated, pacing and repeating sounds as if searching for equilibrium. Music was not just expression for him, it was regulation, the way he stayed connected to himself in a world that never adapted to him. And yet, even under these conditions, his creativity did not fade. He continued composing, drawing inspiration from everything he encountered. Trains, storms, political rallies, and battlefield reports all found their way into his music. He translated the chaos of 19th century America into sound, unconsciously documenting an era from the perspective of someone denied a voice within it. His compositions were often dismissed as novelty pieces, but they carried complexity that later musicians would recognize as ahead of their time. People often asked whether Thomas understood what he was doing. It was a question rooted in discomfort, not curiosity. If he understood, then exploitation became undeniable. If he did not, then audiences could enjoy him without guilt. The truth, as with many autistic individuals, was more nuanced. He understood music profoundly. He understood patterns, emotion, and memory in ways few ever have. What he did not understand was why his life belonged to others. As Section 1 draws toward its end, Thomas stands at a painful intersection, a man with a child's legal status, a genius with no authority, a national treasure treated as property in everything but name. The country that praised him would never ask what he wanted. The hands that applauded him would never unbind him. And the music that made him famous would continue to be both his refuge and his prison. By the time Thomas Wiggins entered his 20s, the country around him had changed its laws, its borders, and its language, but not its treatment of him. Slavery had formally ended, yet Thomas remained bound by a system that simply renamed control as care. His former owner's family, and later appointed guardians, claimed legal authority over his life on the grounds that he was incapable of managing himself. Courts accepted this logic without hesitation. His blindness, his silence, and his unusual behavior were treated as proof that freedom would be dangerous for him. In reality, freedom was dangerous for those who profited from him. Thomas's touring schedule intensified rather than eased. He was now marketed not only as a prodigy, but as a living relic of pre-war wonder, a man who had astonished America as a child and continued to do so as an adult. Posters still called him Blind Tom, freezing him in time, denying him maturity or growth. He was expected to perform the same feats endlessly, as if aging were a betrayal of the miracle audiences had paid to see. His performances became increasingly theatrical. Managers encouraged exaggerated demonstrations of his memory and imitation. He was asked to reproduce long political speeches after hearing them once, to imitate rent instruments vocally, and then translate them onto the piano, to recreate the sounds of entire cities using nothing but keys and rhythm. These acts were framed as proof of his uniqueness, but they were also distractions, keeping attention away from the fact that he lived under total control. Behind the scenes, Thomas's daily life was rigidly structured. He woke when told, ate when told, traveled when told, and played when told. His routines were not built for comfort or well-being, but for efficiency. Any behavior that disrupted performances was discouraged. Any sign of emotional overload was interpreted as misbehavior rather than distress. The concept of accommodation did not exist for him. The world expected him to adapt endlessly, without ever adapting to him. Despite this, those who spent extended time near Thomas noticed that he was not empty or unaware, as popular descriptions suggested. He formed attachments, though quietly. He recognized familiar voices and responded differently to them. He displayed preferences, favoring certain pieces, certain rhythms, certain environments. When allowed to play freely, without audience or instruction, his music became softer, more exploratory, less performative. In those moments, he seemed most himself. Thomas's relationship with sound extended beyond music. He repeated conversations he overheard, sometimes years later, with uncanny accuracy. He remembered the tone, pacing, and emotional weight of voices. To others, this repetition was unsettling. To Thomas, it was memory asserting itself. He did not narrate his life in words, he stored it in echoes. As the decades passed, public interest fluctuated. New entertainers emerged, musical tastes changed. Yet Thomas remained in demand because he could not be replicated. There was no school that could produce another him, no method to teach what he embodied naturally. This uniqueness made him valuable, but also increasingly isolated. He existed outside the evolution of music, preserved as a curiosity rather than allowed to grow as an artist. His compositions during this period grew more complex. He blended classical structures with American sounds, creating pieces that defied categorization. Yet because he did not publish his work independently or advocate for its preservation, much of it was lost, misattributed, or dismissed. Others controlled what was written about him, what was recorded, and what was remembered. His creative legacy became fragmented, filtered through people who never fully understood him. Legally, Thomas's situation became more entrenched over time. Court rulings reaffirmed guardianship arrangements, effectively declaring him perpetually incapable. These decisions were based less on evidence and more on assumption. His inability to speak fluently was equated with inability to think. His autism, though unnamed, was treated as deficiency rather than difference. No one asked whether he wanted control over his earnings, his movements, or his time. The question was never posed. Emotionally, the cost accumulated quietly. Thomas did not rebel in ways others would recognize. He did not run away or protest publicly. His resistance, if it can be called that, was internal. He retreated further into routine, into repetition, into the safety of predictable sound. Music remained his anchor, but even that was increasingly shaped by external demand rather than internal need. Observers later described moments when Thomas appeared overwhelmed by crowds, shrinking physically as noise swelled around him. Applause, meant as praise, often unsettled him. Sudden changes in schedule caused visible distress. Today, these signs would be recognized as sensory overload. At the time, they were ignored or misunderstood. Performance always came. First, the contradiction at the heart of Thomas's life grew sharper with age. He was introduced on stage as a marvel, a genius, a once-in-a-generation talent. Off-stage, he was treated as a dependent, a perpetual child, someone to be managed rather than respected. The same society that celebrated his mind denied him personhood. This contradiction was never resolved during his lifetime. As he moved into middle age, Thomas became a living symbol of something the nation was uncomfortable confronting. He represented black excellence that could not be explained away, yet his exploitation revealed how deeply racism and ableism were intertwined. Acknowledging his full humanity would have required acknowledging the injustice done to him. It was easier to keep him frozen as Blind Tom. His later tours were quieter, but no less controlled. Smaller venues replaced grand halls, but the expectations remained. He still played on command. He still performed memory feats. He still returned each night to rooms chosen for him. The world aged around him. He did not. Time moved forward in ways Thomas could sense but never direct. As his body aged, his guardians adjusted his image rather than his circumstances. He was now presented as a marvel preserved by nature itself, a man who seemed untouched by time, still performing feats first witnessed decades earlier. The narrative suggested innocence and simplicity, as if his life had been spared complexity. In truth, complexity surrounded him constantly. It was simply denied expression. His health began to show signs of strain. Long journeys by train, inconsistent rest, and relentless performance took a toll. He developed physical habits, rocking, humming, repeating fragments of sound that intensified during periods of exhaustion. Rather than interpreting these behaviors as signals of need, those in charge treated them as quirks to be managed or suppressed. Any interruption to performance schedules was considered unacceptable. His well-being mattered only insofar as it affected his ability to play. Musicologists who encountered Thomas later in his career were struck by contradictions in his work. On one hand, his technique remained astonishingly precise. On the other, his compositions revealed emotional depth that challenged the idea that he lacked understanding. There were passages of tenderness, sudden dissonance, moments of restraint that suggested reflection rather than instinct. These elements hinted at an inner life far richer than public descriptions allowed. Yet Thomas never participated in discussions about his own music. He was rarely asked what inspired a piece or what he intended to convey. Others spoke for him, interpreting his work to fit their assumptions. His silence became a blank canvas onto which society projected its comfort and its cruelty. If he did not explain himself, others would explain him away. Privately, those closest to him noticed that Thomas responded strongly to certain environments. He preferred quiet spaces, familiar rooms, predictable routines. When given even brief moments without audience or instruction, he would play differently. Slower, softer, less demonstrative. These moments suggested that the performer the public knew was only a fraction of the musician he actually was. But such moments were rare and undocumented. They did not generate revenue. As decades passed, the legal machinery surrounding Thomas grew heavier. Guardianship disputes arose, not over his freedom, but over control of his income. Courtrooms debated who had the right to manage him, not whether he should manage himself. His voice was absent from these proceedings, replaced by testimonies that emphasized his disabilities while minimizing his capabilities. The law listened carefully to those who benefited from his confinement. Public interest eventually waned, not because Thomas lost ability, but because novelty fades. The world moved toward new forms of entertainment, new technologies, new spectacles. Thomas remained, playing the same piano in a changing world, his genius unchanged but increasingly out of step with popular taste. Performances became less frequent, tours shortened. Control, however, did not loosen. In these later years, Thomas's isolation deepened. Fewer people came to see him, but fewer still came to know him. He existed largely within the narrow boundaries set by his caretakers, his days structured around habit rather than discovery. Music remained constant, but even it began to carry the weight of repetition. He remembered everything he had ever played, and there was no forgetting to make room for rest. When people spoke of him then, they did so in the past tense even while he lived. He was remembered as the boy who amazed America, not the man who endured it. His adulthood did not fit the story audiences preferred. Admitting that he aged meant admitting that he had lived an entire life under control, and the truth was uncomfortable. Yet even in this narrowing world, Thomas's mind remained vast. He continued to absorb sound, memory, and rhythm, storing them endlessly. He was a living archive of a century's noise, war, celebration, grief, industry, all held within someone denied authorship of his own story. His life became a quiet accumulation of moments no one else recorded. As Section 2 reaches its close, Thomas stands older, still gifted, still confined. The applause has softened, the crowds thinned, but the boundaries around him remain firm. His genius has outlived its usefulness to the world that exploited it, leaving him in a kind of living afterimage, present, breathing, remembering, yet increasingly unseen. In the final decades of Thomas Wiggins's life, the world no longer rushed toward him with the same hunger it once had. The noise softened, the crowds thinned, and the sensation that had once defined his existence slowly receded. Yet nothing replaced it. Fame did not transform into freedom, and obscurity did not bring rest. Instead, Thomas entered a quieter, more confined version of the same life he had always known, one shaped entirely by decisions made by others. He lived under constant supervision, his movements limited to spaces deemed appropriate and safe by his guardians. The justification never changed. He was still considered incapable, still described as childlike, still denied autonomy in the name of protection. Years passed, but the legal and social framework around him remained frozen. The man who had memorized the soundscape of an entire nation was never trusted to choose how to spend his own afternoon. Physically, age began to settle into his body. His hands, once tireless, stiffened at times, though his accuracy rarely failed him. His hearing remained sharp, perhaps painfully so, as sensitivity often increases rather than fades. Sounds that others barely noticed, footsteps, doors, distant conversations, continued to reach him with clarity. Memory, too, showed no mercy. He carried every song, every voice, every performance within him, without the relief of forgetting. Those who encountered Thomas in these years often remarked on his calmness, mistaking stillness for contentment. They did not see the cost of a life without choice, or the toll of decades spent performing without consent. His silence made it easy for observers to project peace onto him. Without protest, they assumed acceptance. Without words, they assumed emptiness. Neither assumption was fair. Music remained his primary connection to the world, but even it changed character. With fewer performances scheduled, he played more often in private, repeating familiar pieces, returning to patterns that soothed rather than impressed. These were not concerts, they were rituals. Through repetition, he maintained continuity in a life where almost everything else had been decided for him. The piano was still his refuge, even as it carried the weight of his past. As his public presence faded, so too did institutional interest in preserving his work. No concert halls competed to archive his compositions. No conservatories rushed to study his methods. His music, much like his life, existed in fragments, remembered imperfectly, recorded inconsistently, often misunderstood. The idea that he might be recognized as a serious composer rather than a novelty never fully took hold during his lifetime. When Thomas's health declined more noticeably, care was still framed as control. Decisions about his treatment were made with efficiency rather than empathy. Comfort was provided, but independence was never considered. Even at the end of his life, the assumption of incapacity overrode any recognition of his lived experience. The same traits that had allowed others to exploit him were now used to justify excluding him from the final chapter of his own story. Thomas Wiggins died in 1908, quietly, without ceremony, without the national attention that had once followed his every movement. He was buried without fanfare, his passing noted briefly, if at all. The world that had once profited so greatly from him did not pause to mourn. There were no grand retrospectives, no official reckonings. His death was treated as the fading of a curiosity rather than the loss of a singular human being. In the years that followed, Thomas slipped almost entirely from public memory. His compositions were rarely performed. His story was condensed into anecdotes, stripped of context, repeated without reflection. Blind Tom became a footnote, a strange tale from a distant past, disconnected from the systems that had shaped him. Forgetting, it seemed, was easier than understanding. It would take generations for scholars, musicians, and historians to begin revisiting his life with clearer eyes. When they did, they found a story far more complex than legend suggested. They saw not just a prodigy, but a man denied agency. Not just a marvel, but a victim of intersecting injustices, racism, ableism, and exploitation intertwined so tightly that separating them was impossible. Reevaluations of Thomas's work revealed depth long ignored. His compositions showed structural intelligence, emotional nuance, and innovation that challenged the assumption that he merely imitated. His memory was not a trick, it was a faculty. His silence was not emptiness, it was difference. Slowly, the narrative shifted from spectacle to significance, yet even with renewed interest, something remained irretrievable. Thomas never had the chance to define himself publicly. He never chose how to tell his story. The recognition that came after his death could not undo the decades of control he endured. It could not return the choices taken from him. It could only ask uncomfortable questions about how brilliance is treated when it does not fit accepted norms. Thomas Wiggins's legacy is not just musical, it is ethical. His life forces confrontation with the cost of genius exploited, of difference misunderstood, of humanity denied in the name of fascination. He reminds us that talent does not negate the need for dignity, and that silence does not erase interior life. In the end, Thomas left behind something both fragile and enduring. His music survives in pieces, echoes of a mind that absorbed the world and translated it into sound. His story survives as a warning and a responsibility. To remember him fully is to acknowledge Not only what he gave, but what was taken. And to recognize that genius, when met without compassion, becomes another form of tragedy. The final years of Thomas Wiggins unfolded in near silence, not because sound had left him, but because the world had largely stopped listening. He lived within narrow boundaries, cared for in ways that emphasized supervision over understanding. Those around him spoke about him as if he were already gone, referring to his past achievements rather than his present existence. The man who had once filled halls with astonishment now inhabited small rooms where time moved slowly and predictably, measured not by applause but by routine. Thomas continued to play the piano, though not for crowds. The music in these moments was different. It lacked the forced brilliance demanded by audiences and instead carried a repetitive inward quality. He returned again and again to familiar patterns, not out of limitation but out of need. Repetition grounded him. It gave shape to days that otherwise blended together. The piano was no longer a stage, it was a lifeline. Those who observed him closely noticed that his music had softened. There was less spectacle, more restraint. The thunderous storms of his youth gave way to quieter passages, reflective and lingering. It was as if he were speaking to himself through sound, revisiting memories stored deep within him. Every note carried history. Every pause carried weight. He did not need an audience to validate this music. It existed because he existed. Yet even in this quieter phase, control never loosened. Decisions about where he lived, when he played, and how he was cared for remained firmly in the hands of others. The justification remained unchanged: protection. But protection without autonomy is simply confinement by another name. Thomas was shielded from risk, but also from choice. The world Conti, nude to mistake silence for consent. When illness finally began to overtake him, it did so gradually. His body weakened, but his mind remained alert, absorbing sound until the end. Voices, footsteps, distant noise, everything entered him as it always had. There was no dramatic decline, no public farewell. His life did not end the way it had been lived under bright lights. It ended quietly, almost invisibly. Thomas Wiggins died in 1908. There were no national headlines, no grand memorials. His passing was noted briefly, then absorbed into the endless churn of history. The country that had once profited so heavily from him did not pause to reflect on what it had taken. His death closed a life that had never truly been his own. For years afterward, Thomas existed only as a curiosity in old newspapers and forgotten anecdotes. His compositions gathered dust. His story was simplified, stripped of context and consequence. He was remembered as a miracle, not as a man, as Blind Tom, not as Thomas Wiggins. Forgetting him required far less effort than reckoning with him. But forgetting was never permanent. Slowly, scholars and musicians began to return to his work, listening more carefully than audiences ever had during his lifetime. They heard complexity where others had heard novelty. They saw intention where others had assumed instinct. They recognized that his abilities were not accidents of nature, but expressions of a mind that processed the world differently, not deficiently. Modern understanding reframed Thomas's life in painful clarity. He was autistic in an era that had no language for autism. He was black in a nation structured to deny black intellect. He was disabled in a society that equated disability with incapacity. Each identity alone would have created barriers. Together, they built a cage that no amount of genius could unlock. His story forces uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to celebrate talent while denying humanity? How many times has brilliance been exploited because it came wrapped in difference? How often has silence been misread as emptiness, obedience, or absence of thought? Thomas Wiggins stands as evidence that the cost of such misunderstandings is not abstract. It is lived, day after day, across an entire lifetime. The tragedy of Thomas's life is not that he never spoke in words. It is that no one ever truly listened to the language he was using all along. His music was not a trick. It was communication. It was memory. It was testimony. Through sound, he told the story of a world that used him without knowing him. Today, Thomas Wiggins is remembered differently than he once was. Not as a sideshow, not as a novelty, but as a composer, a prodigy, and a human being whose life reveals as much about society as it does about genius. His legacy is not only in the notes he played, but in the warning he leaves behind. To honor Thomas fully is to understand that brilliance does not erase the need for dignity, that difference does not justify control, and that silence does not mean absence of self. His life asks us to listen more carefully, to music, to history, and to those whose voices do not sound like our own. And in that listening, perhaps at last, Thomas Wiggins is heard.